Well, this is Dr. Stan here at Radio Liberty, coming to you from the hills overlooking beautiful and picturesque Monterey Bay, and bringing you the news behind the news, the story behind the story, hoping to convince you that reality is usually scoffed at and that illusion is usually king. But in the battle for survival of Western civilization, it's going to be reality, not illusion or delusion, that will determine what the future will bring. And I need to remind you the views expressed here are not necessarily those of the owners, management, staff, sponsors, or supporters of the station you're listening to. They happen to be my views. And, well, for the next hour, they're going to be the views of our good friend Joel Skousen from World Affairs Brief. Hi, Joel. How are we doing?
I'm just fine, Dr. Stan. Good to be with you.
Well, what are we going to be talking about today?
Well, let's first talk about the debt ceiling debate as the arbitrary and unnecessary deadline of August 2 nears for, supposed U.S. default. The Obama administration is threatening to shut down the government. His biggest direct threat is to claim the U.S. will have to default on its bonds and that Social Security checks will not go out. Well, these actions are specifically unnecessary, and the President knows it. The government still has income coming in. All it has to do is stop spending more than it takes in. In fact, the debt ceiling limit is already the law of the land and serves, in my opinion, as a balanced budget amendment. There is no need, as Republicans insist, to pass one. As of August 2nd, the government is required to stop spending more than the government takes in. It's just that simple. Isn't that what a balanced budget amendment is for?
Well, what they're trying to do, though, Joel, is confuse everybody. It's all political theater, and the Republicans want to cut taxes, and the Democrats want to provide for the poor and the needy and the elderly, and of course, basically none of them are addressing the real issue, why you can't spend yourself into prosperity. You can't keep spending 40 cents out of every dollar the federal government spends is borrowed money. You can't keep, spending borrowed money. One of these days, of course, the whole debt trap will catch up with you, and you're going to have to start paying interest on all that money you borrowed, and of course, pretty soon, all the money the government takes in, it goes to pay interest on the national debt, and you destroy the nation. And if you want to destroy a nation, there's no better way to do it. And I believe that leaders of both political parties know exactly what they're doing. They just don't want the average individual to know.
Well, I'm particularly disappointed with Senator Jim DeMint, who has been pushing, as a matter of sign on the dotted line, that you will help me pass a balanced budget amendment, and yet he's talking openly about increasing the debt limit. I mean, it doesn't take more than a schoolboy's intelligence to realize that the debt limit is a balanced budget amendment, and it doesn't have to be passed. It's already the law of the land. So that's why I'm making this point, is that Republicans should rephrase this argument as the fact that the debt limit does, in fact, enforce a balanced budget, and that's what we demand. Simply, you're not allowed to shut down the government. You simply have to choose what things you're going to stop spending on, and you should not choose Social Security checks. That is not an entitlement. Social Security is something that people have paid for. I should say it's actually both. It is a contractual agreement for people who have paid in more than they've received. It is an entitlement for people under Social Security who are getting more than they paid in. And that's the problem. It's the Social Security benefits have not been related to what you paid in plus a reasonable rate of interest. They have been related to an entitlement-type outlay, a requirement for inlay and an entitlement-type outlay.
But, of course, one of the worst things is, of course, that neither political party will say, let's pull our troops out of Afghanistan tomorrow. Why do we need 250,000 troops over there to fight about 100 members of Al-Qaeda? Why are we in Afghanistan? Why won't the leaders of either political party stand up and say, let's stop spending so much for our military? We're not defending ourselves against the terrorism. We're antagonizing the Muslims throughout the world by what we're doing. And, of course, we're losing our freedom here at home as a result. Go right ahead, Joel.
Well, President Barack Obama abruptly walked out of a stormy debt limit meeting with congressional leaders Wednesday. This dramatic show was a deliberate move to embarrass House Majority Leader Eric Cantor, who was caught up in a fairly heated argument with the president. It also means the president is determined to keep sabotaging any agreement until the last minute, when threats of default on government bonds will force Republicans to compromise. The Moody's rating agency's quick reaction. Ron Paul says Durden says the man who yesterday got into a heated argument with the Fed chairman on whether gold is or isn't money, in a Bernanke response that gold isn't money, has been already mocked to death, so I'll leave it alone, he says, but shares his take on the most recent bout of scaremongering by Moody's. Ron Paul, when asked if the American AAA rating is worth saving, replied, probably not. I think if you had a market evaluation on this issue, it would probably be marked down a long time ago. The reason the downgrade will come regardless is that ultimately it's going to happen anyway because we are insolvent. So he says, I think it is part of the game to make sure everyone is fearful so we can continue the process. Long term, I think raising the debt limit is a negative because it delays the inevitable. It will give us much bigger problems down the road, and that's true. Of course, the government will threaten to default and shut down in order to force the debt limit to be raised, but all this is just a high-stakes game of political brinkmanship, as you have said. The sides are both hardened. Obama won't specify what cuts and entitlements he will make, which would be political suicide for anybody, Republican or Democrat, and demands tax increases on the rich. And the Republicans, on the other hand, say no tax increases. Well, the plan put forth by Senator Mitch McConnell is a sham ploy on behalf of liberal Republicans who want to continue spending. Jim DeMint tacitly dismissed McConnell's controversial plan, which would authorize President Obama to raise the debt ceiling 3 times before the end of 2012, with the contingency that he submit a list of commensurate spending cuts. McConnell's plan, which would, while allowing them to avoid voting on raising the debt limit, also essentially cedes all authority to the president on the matter. Of course, it's also obvious that Obama would not be required to enact any of the cuts he proposes. That's why this proposal is a sham. All he has to do is say, I'm going to unilaterally raise the debt limit $2 trillion, and I'm going to propose $2 trillion in cuts, but nobody has to enact the cuts. I mean, it's just incredible that McConnell, liberal Republican, would have the audacity to submit this. In a Wednesday appearance on CBS's early show...
Hold that thought, Joel. We'll be right back here. Well, this is Dr. Stan, and Joel is just talking about the political theater, and that's all that it is. Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader, is a sellout to the Democrats, and of course they keep talking about, we'll raise the debt limit if Barack Obama promises to offer, a list of tax cuts, but there's not going to be any tax cuts. There's not going to be any programs done away with. This is all political theater. And I think that what Joel says is quite true. Quoting Congressman Ron Paul said, America is insolvent. There is no way around the situation that we're in today, and simply raising the debt limit simply puts off the day when we're going to have to face the fact that America is insolvent. We have massive debts. We can never possibly pay them off. Go right ahead.
Well, as an aside, Ron Paul has announced that he's not going to be running for the Congress again in 2012. As expected, this is his last run in politics, and he's going to dedicate all of his efforts to winning the presidential nomination. I doubt if that's going to happen. I don't think there's enough principled people except us to try to make it happen. But in essence, he's reached 75 years of old, and I think it's the last time around for Ron. So we're going to miss him very much in Congress. I'm sure he's going to continue to play a role in the campaign for liberty and the Tea Party movement. We still have his son Rand Paul in the Senate, and he's doing a very good job at standing up for hardcore principles. But in this budget debate, I'm very disappointed in Jim DeMint, who actually argued when he was on the early show that this idea that the Republicans will not vote to increase the debt limit is wrong. We are going to introduce a plan that will give the president an increase in the debt limit, but it's contingent on cutting spending and capping spending over several years. and giving the states the opportunity to decide if we're going to balance our budget in the next decade. This is just ridiculous. I mean, you can't play that game of demanding a balanced budget amendment and then compromise on these issues and say, well, we're going to have a slowdown in spending for the next decade. None of these things actually propose a reduction in spending, just a slowdown in spending.
And I think people have to understand you can pass a balanced budget amendment, and then, of course, you can always balance the budget by just massively increasing taxes. So that isn't a balanced budget amendment, doesn't solve anything. All it does is ensure that they're going to increase taxes, which will strangle the economy even more. What they need to do is balance the budget by cutting spending and cutting programs, not by passing a balanced budget amendment. We already have laws that stipulate we will have a balanced budget, and everybody ignores them. And the balanced budget amendment has all sorts of loopholes in it anyway. It's a rotten idea, and I'm ashamed of Senator DeMint.
Well, why put off balancing the budget when the way to force it is right at hand now? And that's the beauty of the debt limit, is that you don't have to argue about any balance. You just have to stop spending in excess of the limit. In other words, you can expend only with money that is in hand. And so even without a budget, of course, the government has to pick and choose what they're going to spend. Now, naturally, they are choosing to cut things that will hurt people the most and will damage markets the most in order to get their way. But as James Quinn of the Burning Platform said, I'll let you in on the secret, the debt ceiling will be raised. Sorry to ruin the surprise, but this entire sordid episode has nothing to do with our dire economic situation. It's about the 2012 election. Both parties are conducting overnight polling on which talking points are working best in convincing the people that their party is less likely to be blamed for the shutdown of the government. Well, Obama's poll numbers are dropping dramatically, and so it looks as if he may get a lot of the blame if he shuts down the government. But it's not going to be a pretty sight. The supposedly grand compromise that the Republicans and Democrats have talked about would have cut $4 trillion from future deficits fell apart last week. The Democrats wouldn't cut entitlements, the Republicans wouldn't raise taxes. The latest proposal was down to $2 trillion in future cuts, but neither side could agree on what and when. And this solution cuts nothing, as I said. Neither party wants to get blamed for shutting down the government. Republicans blinked first. Honor, truth, and reality-based solutions are non-existent in Washington, D.C. We can never trust these people to do the right thing.
But Joe, what they're talking about is a $2 trillion reduction over a 10-year period. Remember, we have a deficit at the present time about $1.4 trillion. So if you reduce that by 200
per year,
right?
And so over 10 years, that's $2 trillion out of $12 trillion.
Right.
In debt, you know.
I mean, it's so ridiculous, and but nobody's telling the American people. After all, it's cutting $2 trillion sounds like they're going to do a lot, but it's over a 10-year period. They have no intention of trying to save this country. They want to destroy the financial structure of our nation. When you look at it, it all makes sense. If you look at it rationally, nothing going on makes sense.
Well, I would only disagree with your statement in the following way. They're not out to destroy the finances of the country. They're out to buy votes without having to tax people. They're out to project a globalist agenda without having to tax people. That's what the foreign wars are about, and that's why they are not giving people a tax bill every year. They have no intention of destroying the government that supports their political agenda. They want to simply have their cake and eat it too. That is, to buy unlimited amounts of product, benefits, wars, and other things without having to tax the people, because if you tax them, you have immediate retribution from the voters. And that's why, Ron Paul has been in favor of, of taxing the American people. That's the quickest way. I mean, not taxing them, by, making them pay the taxes for every war and every entitlement, and therefore you get the maximum backlash from the people, and that's what you need. But they won't do it. Even in the crisis that's brewing, and I'll talk about this relative to the Greek debt crisis, the crisis that's brewing will not result in the fall of the European Union. It will, in fact, strengthen it because they'll use every crisis saying, look, you'll have collapse, or let us print some more money and bail this thing out. And let us say print more money and bail out. Every time they'll choose to bail out rather than collapse. And this keeps going until there are no more options left. And as I say, I predict they'll give us a war before there are no options left. And a war justifies all things financial. They'll simply give up all liberties, all rights, and say, save us, just save us. So that's what we're looking for, and that's a realistic view, in my opinion.
Well, I won't disagree with you. We can see the war coming as we topple nation after nation after nation in the Near East and the Middle East. And believe me, ladies and gentlemen, these are not spontaneous uprisings. Go right ahead.
Even in the Middle East, among all the Muslim people, Barack Obama's name is mud. He is not popular with them. But going back to the economic situation, as James Quinn says, even using ridiculously optimistic assumptions like interest rates staying low, no new wars, ending existing wars, no recessions, no new programs, both of the corrupt political parties show ongoing deficits. Even without any additional spending, still you have, with existing programs, ongoing deficits of $500 billion to $1 trillion per year forever. Does that sound like cuts in spending? Well, the proposed deductions in spending are like, well, I won't quote the analogy he gives. In any case, both Democrat and Republican budget plans ensure economic collapse within the next 10 years. Actually, I disagree with that. I think they could stretch it out longer with inflation. Again, he says our national debt would rise from $14.3 trillion today to $23 to $26 trillion in 10 years. Does that sound like spending cuts to you? Luckily, he says we'll never reach those levels. We will hit $20 trillion in debt by 2015. That is a lock. Total government revenue today is $1.75 trillion. We spend approximately $1 trillion per year on military adventures, 46% of our total revenue. If interest rates are 5% in 2015, we will spend $1 trillion of interest. If rates are 10%, we will spend $2 trillion in interest. But believe me, they'll manipulate those figures down. We won't reach bankruptcy is when essentially the interest payments absorb all of the income, and we're nowhere near that in 2015. I think it takes to 2025 to realistically reach that. So they do have time to continue to inflate and continue to pacify people, and I think we'll have war before 2025. He says, do you get the picture? An unsustainable trend will not be sustained. That's true if you go out long enough. We have two choices. He says we can proactively address the problem or just wait for the collapse of the economic system. This debt-feeding reality shows all the proof I need. Our leaders will choose to wait for collapse. It won't be long. That's where I disagree. Quinn and others underestimate how governments can prolong the inevitable and then use the beginnings of a collapse to bolster their power to engage in more desperate measures. And what I've said is true. Look at what happened in the threats of collapse that led to the TARP bailout. Did the U.S. end up with more or less power? More power. Only hyperinflation can destroy that process of spending our way out of these problems. And as I've explained numerous times, the supply of U.S. dollars is already so high, spread out around the world, that they can create trillions more without causing hyperinflation. In the end, all the analysts miss the one big option the powers that be are planning to use, and that, as I said, is war. They will bring down war upon us by Russia and China before actual economic collapse arrives. Nuclear war will justify anything, including a default. In the process, they will start over with a new world order of world government.
And the idea that we could ever face a nuclear war, that's so foreign to the average American. And yet, of course, I really fear that it's not simply accidental, that we allowed the transfer of nuclear technology to Pakistan. If you haven't read my January 2008 newsletter at Radio Liberty, read the Sybil Edmonds story. Everybody in the world knows it, except the people here in America, where we have freedom of the press. What's freedom of the press? You own the press, you have the freedom to suppress whatever you want. And I agree. I believe a nuclear war is coming, and you better be prepared for it. Joel, you go right ahead.
Well, let's talk about the EU and the Greek default. The financial world is going to get a chance to see just what I'm talking about as the powers that be manipulate the Greek economic disaster into even more fiat money and more power to the EU. The European Union is actually in worse shape than the U.S. because it doesn't have the huge base of dollars to leverage against the inflation the EU Central Bank needs to create in order to bail out all of the southern tier of nations in Europe, the ones with the most socialism. EU bankers are already talking about a partial default. Here's Alexander Higgins. He says, European leaders are now openly admitting they are preparing for an imminent default of Greek debt, causing the bank-run media, who have been warning of Armageddon scenarios and global defaults, to suddenly develop schizophrenia, throwing their propaganda machine into reverse and running stories like, no big deal if Greece defaults. And this is really interesting. Truth be told, China is scared enough that they've stepped in to offer billions of dollars to suck up worthless European sovereign debt. Billionaire hedge fund manager George Soros isn't buying the Wall Street propaganda's attempt to manipulate the market psychology either. He tells reporters that a Greek default debt will trigger a global economic collapse that will begin with the Greek default debt and spread from there. Well, my opinion is they may call it a collapse. They may say it's collapsing, but it won't actually be one. It'll only be the excuse to spread out more fiat money and justify more of the infusions of money that are carrying us today. As I last wrote, says Higgins, the Greek army has threatened a military coup if politicians approve a new IMF bailout loan with an over 30% interest rate. Now, he's wrong on that. It's only a 3% interest rate. The interest rate on Greek bonds is 30%, but this IMF loan is 3%, but it has lots of sovereignty-robbing strings attached. Of course, the loan isn't going to bail out the citizens of Greece who are facing unimaginable austerity measures, he says. My comment, hardly unimaginable austerity measures. They're actually fairly essential and minimal austerity measures to pay back the loan, but the bailout is instead for the greedy German, French, and British bankers who put the nation in the situation they're in by continuing to engage in the same scandalous financial practices that caused this meltdown. Well, while I'm not in favor of any of these big banks, who have, of course, engaged in a lot of predatory practices, let's be frank, the Greeks are just as much to blame for spending more than they had and needing these loans. The bankers are just there to offer the traps that are being closed right now on them. Well, the latest IMF loan is one of the various ways in which the U.S. Treasury is using its hidden hand to support Europe's bailout, but it won't be nearly enough. Tyler Durden of Zero Hedge explains the IMF is delighted to announce that it has just approved a 3.2 trillion euro disbursement of cash for Greece, its fifth bailout as part of the 12 billion in money that Greece needs in order to continue operating in the months of July and August. And just for what purpose will this money be used, one may ask? Well, as explained a few weeks ago in Greek math, 12 billion euros in, 18.2 billion euros out. What that means is it still isn't covering the outflow of 18.2 billion. I mean, this country is bankrupt, and it's good money after bad. Even the IMF is saying that Greece needs an additional, get this, Stan, $142 billion.
Hold that thought.
From the private sector.
Well, Dr. Stan, Joel is just saying that even the IMF says Greece is going to need an additional $142 billion, or billion pounds, whatever it is over there. And Greece is certainly in terrible straits, and even with all the things that they're doing, adding a value-added tax, I think it's going to be up to about this federal sales tax of about 25%, and raising the retirement from 50 to 65 years of age, and certainly a third of all of the people who are working in Greece work for the government. And a lot of them are going to lose their jobs. They're going to be the wonderful utopian society they've had over there, where you could retire at 50, is going to cease to exist. But of course, in many respects, we have very similar problems here. We're living far beyond our means, and And nobody wants to admit that maybe Greece is certainly not a lot worse off than we are, but go right ahead.
Well, what we're talking about is the fact that these bailouts, now, get this in perspective. The IMF says Greece needs 12 billion euros just for July and August. They need a total of 147 additional billion. I'm converting dollars here. And that should come from the private sector, but there's a fat chance that nobody in the private sector is going to invest in Greece because they've got an outflow of $18.2 billion every 2 months. And even with the bailouts of $12 billion, it isn't enough. I mean, who's foolish to keep putting in good money after bad?
Well, I think right now Greek bonds are bringing over 20%. In other words, the government's selling bonds, and they're having to pay 20% interest rate on their bonds. How long can you continue doing that?
Yeah, it's actually 30% today. So
30% is worse. Okay.
It's not dramatically, Stan. And that's why I say nobody's, even for 30%, it gets to a point you can offer anybody anything, but when they know that you're going to default next week, what good is a promise to pay 30% when you're not going to get anything? Simply put, the European Central Bank, the EU, and the IF money that they're throwing in is money that's going out to their other bankers. And it's not enough to keep the default from occurring because the private sector is not willing to kick in the additional $140 billion that's necessary. 17% of the money coming from the IMF comes from U.S. taxpayers. And since 25% of the quota contributions allocated to the IMF are deemed non-usable, the actual number funded by the U.S. is likely much higher, and I believe that. But this plot has a bonus kicker. As we reported on Wednesday, the actual Greek debt is no longer owned by European banks to the extent that it has been previously expected. A development that threatens to scuttle the entire second Greek bailout plan is that as banks have been selling Greek debt, who's been buying? Well, mostly hedge funds, such as everyone's favorite John Paulson up in the United States, connected to Goldman Sachs. Here's an example of the current propaganda from the mainstream financial media preparing the public for the no big deal Greek default. Forbes wrote, "Stop worrying about a Greek default. That Greece is, in some point, going to default in its public debt is a foregone conclusion," says Forbes, all of which makes some of what we would prevent. Some of those who would prevent it are saying somewhat moot. However, that doesn't seem to stop most people from saying some very silly things. Take this. Senior European figures said London needed to focus more urgently on the potential effect of a Greek default on the UK, the UK's banking sector and the economy. The UK is the third largest exposure after France and Germany, said a high-level EU source. So the problem with that kind of thinking, Stan, is that it evades the growing domino effect looming with follow-on defaults in Italy, Spain, and Portugal. As Ms. Shedlock writes, the bond vigilantes are out in force in the European sovereign debt market. Portugal's two-year debt hit 18.36% today. Greece hit 31.34%. Ireland 17.8% with new record high spreads. In response to the EU calls emergency meeting on Italy, the media says, "Don't worry, it's a coordination meeting, not a crisis." I mean, these people are just in rampant denial. But maybe they know something the public doesn't know, and that is that they will continue to bail out and that there will be no collapse. But, you know, as I say, this is going to be at least a partial collapse. As Timothy Geithner said, this could be the second round of the storm that he predicted to Wall Street insiders.
But what is this going to mean as far as the derivative contracts, that many of which are that insure the debt of all the pig nations, and in fact a lot of those derivative contracts are held by our major banks. But I suppose that taxpayers will go ahead and bail out our major banks. After all, they're too big to fail, so we'll just give them more money.
Yeah, that's what's going to happen.
Well, I fear you're right. Our guest is Joel Skousen. Ladies and gentlemen, we're living in tumultuous times, and people have very little idea what's really going on. We'll be back in just a moment with Joel Skousen here at Radio Liberty.
Let us swear allegiance
Joel, you go right ahead. I mean, 31%, that is just unbelievable. I'll have to admit I'd missed that. Go right ahead.
Well, what is at risk here is not Italy rather than the euro itself, writes James Quinn. The Eurozone suffers from an incomplete financial system. My comment is it's not only because it doesn't have the full fiat money powers and large base of currency that the U.S. does, which is not a legitimate financial system, even if it could use them. The collection of sovereign states that adopted the euro have toothless central banks that in turn depend on a toothless European central bank. The ECU is not a central bank equivalent to the U.S. Federal Reserve or the Bank of England, as there is no European treasury and no central taxing authority. But you see, it is, in the sense, equal to the Fed, in the sense that it can inflate at will. The individual banks in the EU cannot, but the European bank can, and that's what makes it equal. But it is hampered in the sense that you have all of these sovereign states, Germany, France, Spain, Italy, etc., watching over their shoulder. And they're technically not allowed to do that, whereas, as the Fed does whatever it wants and the Bank of England does whatever it wants. So there is a difference there, but it's not a good difference. It's not as if, as the author is writing, the ECU should have the full powers of the Fed. And no, nobody should have those powers to simply create money at will without backing. He says the assumption was that these banks did not have to have reserves against sovereign debt as there was no default risk. As the real problem of default was recognized, these banks bought credit default swap insurance, but the insurers, as you just pointed out, American too big to fail banks cannot pay them off. Hence, another bailout will be coming for American banks if these credit defaults, which they're going to come. There's a lot of credit default swaps on Greece alone, which is sure to default. Whether or not it goes to the other countries, I mean, let's talk about some of those others. The PIGS country, Portugal, Italy, Ireland, Greece, and Spain, that's where the acronym PIGS comes from, how apt, have the power to bring the euro down, he says. The German public has the power to bring the euro down. And I say that's laughable. Voters have no power to control government when government controls their money. Many European banks are on life support from the U.S. Federal Reserve since the EU is toothless. Thus, the U.S. is a hidden party to these negotiations. So in the Eurozone, we have insolvent banks, insolvent governments, and a currency union that lacks the full set of tools to survive.
Hold that thought. We're going to be back here in just a moment when we bring all of our stations back on board. Well, this is Dr. Stan, and certainly Joel is just talking about if there is a default or partial default over in Europe by Greece. A lot, of course, of the insurance policies that say, well, Greece hasn't got a default, you buy their loans, their bonds, you got nothing to worry about because we'll guarantee them. A lot of the people who've written these so-called insurance policies, they call them CDS or derivatives, are American banks. And so if Greece goes down, or at least Greece defaults or partially defaults, our major American banks are going to be on the hook for literally, possibly hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars. But then you don't have to worry because, you see, our government will guarantee our banks. They're too big to fail. We couldn't let them fail. After all, it would create problems here at home. So we'll just create more money to bail our banks out so the bankers, leaders will get their massive bonuses. They're making $30, $40, $50 million a year, the CEOs, heads of these banks. And where's it coming from? Why, Mr. and Mrs. America, many of them out of work for many months or perhaps even years. Well, Joel, before we go on, I want to tell our listeners how they can get a copy of the World Affairs Brief and subscribe to the World Affairs Brief and keep abreast of what's really going on behind the scenes.
Thanks, Dan. The World Affairs Brief comes out every week. It will be coming out tomorrow on Friday, this latest edition that we're talking about. People can get a free sample copy by emailing me at editor@worldaffairsbrief.com. In addition, on my website, or a rundown of all the books that I have this philosophy of believing that as we fight for our liberty and fight to inform people, we still need to prepare for a takedown if we should lose this. And we keep losing every year, so it is wise to be able to prepare to survive. I have 3 major books in the field preparedness and survival. One is strategic relocation, North American Guide to Safe Places. The all-new third edition is out, which covers everything from foreign retreats to analysis with colored maps of every state and province in North America. My major work is The Secure Home, 700 pages of everything from A to Z on how to prepare for security and self-sufficiency in a home.
And those books are available by calling 1-800-544-8927. We carry Joel's books, and they're among our best sellers. So go right ahead, Joel.
Well, many Europeans are on life support from the U.S. Federal Reserve System. No wonder the bond vigilantes are out in force. And what that means is that they are demanding that if we're going to invest in any of these sovereign debt bonds, that we want interest rates that are commensurate with the risk. And that's why the interest rates are rising exponentially. That's always a prelude to default. Crisis in Italy is escalating. Did anyone really think that Italy would just be able to get through this thing without needing a bailout? Just when you thought that things in Europe could get back to normal for a little while, here comes Italy. On Friday, there was a bit of a mini panic as investors started dumping Italian financial assets. European officials are concerned that sovereign debt crisis that has ravaged Greece, Ireland, and Portugal will now put the Italian economy through the ringer. European Council President Herman Van Rompuy has called an emergency meeting for Monday morning. He's denying that the meeting is about Italy, but everybody knows it is. What's going on in Italy right now is potentially far more serious than what's been going on in Greece. Italy is the fourth largest economy in the European Union. If Italy requires a bailout, the rest of Europe might not be able to handle it. It's enormous. An anonymous European Central Bank source told one German newspaper that the existing rescue fund in Europe is not sufficient to provide a credible defensive wall for Italy. The current bailout fund was never designed for that. Italy has already implemented austerity measures. This was not supposed to happen, but it is happening. This latest crisis was precipitated by a substantial sell-off of Italian financial assets last Friday. An article posted by Bloomberg described the pounding that the two largest Italian banks fell to the lowest level in more than 2 years in Milan yesterday as contagion from Europeans' debt crisis threatened to spread to the region's third largest economy. And when you look at them as a group, the stocks of the 5 largest Italian banks have lost 27% since the beginning of this year. That's not a good sign, Stan. Also, investors are starting to dump Italian government bonds. The Italian national debt is now up to 120% of GDP. The government would be able to manage it if interest rates were very, very low, but unfortunately, they're rising very, very fast as people lose confidence in these governments' ability to pay. As I've written about previously, government debt becomes very painful once you take low interest rates out of the equation. For example, if Greece could borrow all of the money that it wanted to, like the Fed at 0% interest rate, it would not have a debt problem. But now the yield on 2-year Greek bonds is over 30%, and there's not a government on the face of the earth that can afford to pay interest that high for very long. And that's why the need for increasingly higher bailouts every 2 months because of this high interest rate. Unfortunately for Italy, this could just be the beginning of rising interest rates. Just recently, Moody's warned that it may be forced to downgrade Italy's A2 or AA2 debt rating at some point within the next couple of months. If things continue to unravel in Italy, all of the credit agencies may downgrade Italy sooner rather than later. Not that the U.S. government is much better. Our government could becomes more corrupt with each passing year. What's the solution for the EU? Well, they're probably going to have to fire up the printing presses just because it will probably take a whole lot more euros than they have right now to bail things out. The truth is that the EU is now entering a permanent financial crisis. You have a whole bunch of nations that have accumulated unsustainable debt and that cannot print their own currency. The financial system of the EU, as currently constructed does not work. And of course, the implication is there all you need is more powers of fiat money, and it will work, and that will only postpone it. But it certainly will not be allowed to fail, in my opinion.
And I'm sure this is why gold and silver have gone up so dramatically this past week.
Yes, indeed, and why the dollar is taking a beating. And even the euro, of course, is taking a beating. Well, Bernanke is hinting about another round of quantitative easing. It was only a few weeks ago that the Fed chairman, Ben Bernanke, claimed that there would be no more quantitative easing. I said at the time he was lying, and I was right. As Jeff Cox of CNBC said, the central bank chairman stunned financial markets Wednesday when he told Congress that the next round of stimulus, much like objects in the rearview mirror, is closer than it may appear. While there are plenty of caveats and continued references to the slowdown being nothing more than a soft patch in the road, 14 million Americans without jobs, that bar for releasing more funds doesn't look so high anymore. Bernanke thinks the answer to everything is money printing, says Michael Pinto. He's the senior economist for Euro Pacific Capital. He thinks that Bernanke thinks that what saved us from the Great Depression Part 2 and what could have saved us from Depression Part 1 is printing money. And he's doing just that. I can't fathom the logic. Since Bernanke delivered his seminal remarks in Jackson Hole, Wyoming last August, signaling QE2, the dollar's lost nearly 10% of its value against the world's currencies. In the meantime, import prices have jumped about 13%, and inflation has risen about 3.6%. Tamped down primarily by sagging housing and rent costs, which make up 40% of the government's main price gauge, which is, of course, the CPI, and it's heavily understated. Bernanke is considering more asset purchases to lengthen the average duration of this quantitative easing. So here we go again, Stan.
Yes, I'm afraid that we're in for some very, very difficult economic times, but basically the cost of people, if they're not buying a house, certainly not seeing falling prices, but certainly the price of food is going up, the price of gasoline is going up, as you pointed out, the price of imports, and most of our textiles and things of that sort are rising, and certainly I've seen this definitely in shirts and certainly clothing coming from overseas, dramatic increases in prices. So certainly when they tell us there's nothing to worry about, there's no inflation, I think, of course, that they're just like any government officials. They're simply recalculating the method by which they determine inflation to go along with the government policy which says there's nothing to worry about, just trust us, we'll look after you little people. That's
right. Well, moving to another subject, newly designated Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta was in Iraq this past week, blaming Iran for everything. It was the central theme of his new and first visit to Iraq. I think this visit was likely planned as his first act on duty as a means of prepping the U.S. military and the public for what the U.S. and Israel are still planning, an air assault on Iran. The Tribune said Panetta was harking back to the old discredited days of the Bush administration blaming 9/11 on al-Qaeda in Iraq, which was proven false, and language strikingly reminiscent of the Bush administration's justification for invading Iraq. Defense Secretary Leon Panetta told a group of U.S. soldiers at a base outside Baghdad on Monday that the reason you guys are here is because of 9/11. His words seem to be at odds with arguments made by President Barack Obama and other critics of the 2003 invasion who have said that al-Qaeda, which carried out as we know, didn't carry out the September 11 attacks, but that's the general belief, attacks in the U.S. only developed a presence in Iraq after the Bush administration decided to overthrow Saddam Hussein. Philip Giraldi also noted the false theme of the Secretary of Defense. He said two things that are interesting. First, he connected the unrest in Iraq to al-Qaeda, claiming that there are 1,000 terrorists in the country. The comment has either been seen as a gaffe or as the implausible but generally expected citation of al-Qaeda to tie in the continued Iraqi presence of American soldiers to the terrors of 9/11. This is the common ploy used by politicians when they have no other argument to make. That is, subject, verb, 9/11. That's an interesting play on words. Whatever they say, 9/11 is the result. To me, it's also a sign that the speaker is a globalist or a neocon. Well, his second comment was that Iran is behind the weapons being used to kill American soldiers in Iraq. He said that the weapons have been provided to Shiite militias that are opposing the U.S. presence in the country. He was obviously referring to militias controlled by cleric Muqtada al-Sadr. He said that the United States would act unilaterally to defend its soldiers and would take other unspecified steps to counter Iranian involvement. Well, that's a not-so-subtle hint about a warning on attack unilaterally. But the issue of Iranian support for Shia militias is more serious than the al-Qaeda play, in that it can be considered to be a casus belli, that they're killing our troops. It also ties into a recent comment by Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Admiral Mullen, and a reported statement by senior State Department officials in Iraq. Thomas Meades admitted that there was no actual proof that Iran was involved, only classified intelligence. In other words, I can't tell you, but I think it's true. I've been following this issue, says Giraldi, ever since it surfaced in 2005 when it was claimed that Iranians supplied improvised IEDs, improvised explosive devices that are being used in Iraq and later in Afghanistan. The evidence for the Iranian involvement has always been on the thin side, particularly as it was subsequently discovered that many of the weapons were being manufactured in a former bicycle factory in Iraq. They are definitely low-tech, and the need for Iranian involvement was always somewhat suspect. Iran is perpetually the government's favorite target for abuse and will likely only get worse as the presidential election approaches. Both Republicans and Democrats like to condemn Iran. It's interesting how the White House sees the Iran as a problem because the U.S. has hundreds of thousands of troops in the neighborhood. Take away the troops who are dying while accomplishing nothing, and bingo, Iran ceases to be a problem. Well, that's viewed from a person who doesn't see the conspiratorial globalist aspects. It wouldn't cease to become a problem even when the U.S. troops weren't there. They'd find some other reason, but it's much more convenient. I don't think the U.S. will ever withdraw troops out of harm's way because they want the fact or the potential that any Iranian retaliation from an Israeli preemptive strike on Iran will, in fact, harm U.S. troops and thereby instantly justify U.S. involvement in continuing the attack on Iran. There has to be a reason for the 4 huge air bases in Iraq with this multi-billion-dollar infrastructure and the biggest embassy in the world. The U.S. has no intent on leaving Iraq. Supposedly, the remaining U.S. troops in Iraq are there to train, but as Kurt Niemel of PrisonPlanet.com said, Panetta said the Pentagon will soon act against the militias. That's combat, not training. And shame on the media for not picking up on these contradictions.
Well, I think everybody's forgotten who installed the Ayatollah's radical regime in Iran back in 1979. People have forgotten. It was the CIA working behind the scenes that toppled the Shah and brought the Ayatollahs to power. But we never talk about that. I wonder why. Go right ahead.
That's absolutely correct. The CIA was, in fact, paying the bills for Ayatollah in a very wealthy villa in the Paris area, and the U.S. was the one that flew him into Iran. Well, the assassination of Afghan President Hamid Karzai's half-brother, Ahmed Wali, is a major blow to Karzai's control scheme in southern Afghanistan. His brother was Karzai's main payoff man and enforcer in this turbulent part of the country, where competing warlords are constantly a threat to the U.S. puppet regime. The facts are these. Ahmed Wali Karzai, the half-brother Afghan president, Karzai was assassinated by one of his own bodyguards Tuesday morning. Friend and trusted head of security, Sadar Mohammed, shot him in the head and chest. Mohammed was in turn shot and killed by fellow bodyguards. The Taliban claimed responsibility for the assassination. In 2009, it was reported that Karzai was a major player in the opium drug trade in Afghanistan. According to reports, other members of the Karzai family are involved head to heels in the drug business. Ahmed Wali Karzai also worked for the CIA. That was from Kurt Niemel. Well, let's take apart this involvement in CIA and drug running. There's no point, as Boiling Frog's Post wrote, wasting too many words in space rehashing what every media outlet has been reporting. But here's the inside story. When the U.S. media began reporting on this kingpin, Ahmed Wali Karzai, and his heroin network and shady deals almost 2 years ago. This is how it always goes when the relationship between kingpins like Karzai starts going sour with their masters at Langley, referring to the CIA. My comment is that often in the case of Panama's Noriega, they get out of sorts with the CIA in their drug traffic because they get greedy and start taking a bigger cut than the CIA allows. For years, or actually decades, while the relationships are prosperous and mutually beneficial, these kingpins in the drug world are miraculously shielded from the media. no matter how much evidence and legitimate reports from even more legitimate sources come available, you can't get the media to ever mention Karzai's relationship to drugs. And then, when the Langley bosses see that their assets surpass their negative liabilities, all of a sudden the media starts to pour out negative news about them. Just incredible.
But of course, the thing is, nobody here in the United States wants to talk about the fact that the largest distributor of opiates and heroin in the world is our own CIA. And this is the incredible thing about this. I mean, the Taliban had stopped the drug traffic. Now the Americans are there guarding the drug fields, while, of course, the drug trade is booming. Nobody wants to talk about it, and certainly not the controlled media in the United States. The CIA is the largest purveyor of drugs in the world. Go right ahead.
Well, Ahmed Wali is being replaced by his brother Shah Wali Karzai, according to the New York Times. He's supposedly a businessman who managed property development in Kandahar City, but has avoided the political life and is a pale shadow of his elder brother Ahmed. The new Karzai will face challenges in the South, says one source. Ahmed Wali Khan was a very important man in the working for his brother, the president. He was a feared henchman and dispenser of drug money. The CIA can make sure that he has money to dispense, but nothing else. They can't turn the replacement Shah Wali Karzai into the strongman that his brother was. Shah Wali Karzai spent a lot of time in the United States where the CIA and undoubtedly developed a relationship with him, but returned to assist his brother and worked in the presidential palace for a year, but then left over disagreements. He moved to Kandahar, and they set him up as a property developer. He was criticized for having acquired a lot of government land at zero cost to be able to develop modern and well-run developments. Well, that's easy to do when you don't have to compete in the real market and have access to slush funds from drugs. But this is not going to work, in my opinion, in the sense that he's not going to be able to replace his brother. It may build just a placeholder until the powers that be find somebody else to take his place.
It's interesting that the Taliban that does away with this major player in the drug scene, it's not the CIA. Go ahead.
But it wasn't actually the Taliban. That's the point. They claimed credit for it, but it actually was a CIA knockoff.
Oh, it was? Okay, no, I didn't get that. Okay, go right ahead.
Well, because Sadar Mohammed, the shooter, who was in fact the most trusted man in the family, was the head of the security guard, was not a Taliban man. He had no relationship with the Taliban.
I mean, that was a false report about the Taliban.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah. And so, in essence, this harks back to the days in Vietnam when the CIA assassinated President Diem. The results were a catastrophe. Increase in heroin trade in the U.S. Beginning in the 1970s was directly attributed to CIA influence in the Iron Triangle, where under General Kun San, he had a direct pipeline through Richard Armitage, Deputy Secretary of State, presently Deputy Secretary of State, who ran the drug trade for the CIA. It's been a real problem for the United States and will continue to be as long as we have a dark side of government.
Amen.
That's why,
right
I
ahead.
continue to emphasize, Dan, that the real problem in our government is not whether or not we elect a Republican or Democrat. We've got to elect someone who understands the nature of the dark side of government.
Hold that thought. And Joel is just saying, of course, the real problem is we're not going to solve it by electing Republican or Democrat. The only way you're going to solve the problem is that people understand there is a dark side to the government. I call it the Brotherhood of Darkness. Call it what you will. There really are dark forces that work within both political parties. Parting thought, Joel, we're out of time.
Well, no, I'm just glad to be with you again, Dr. Stan. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow.
All right, God bless. Bye-bye. Okay, that's Joel Skousen. His books, if you'd like to get them, Strategic Relocation, The Secure Home, and Building a Secure Room. Certainly they're available by calling 1-800-544-8927. Is the CIA involved in the drug trade? Yeah, we've got a great 4-tape set. Actually, it's 6 different segments in that. You'll even hear. So the President of the United States, Bill Clinton, when asked about the drug smuggling at Mena Airport, and when he was the governor, why Bill Clinton says, well, that wasn't me. That was a federal operation, that drug smuggling in Mena. Of course, he's the President of the United States at the time he's making that statement, and this is actually a duplication of one of his press conferences. Understand, ladies and gentlemen, we've got this great 4-tape set. Is there really a war on drugs? And the answer is absolutely not. We've got the book Defrauding America and Drugging America by Rodney Stitch. You need to get them and read them. The largest purveyor of drugs in the United States and throughout the world is our own CIA. But how could that be? Why? Because we have a dark side of government. And certainly most people in the CIA are very patriotic. But CIA is compartmentalized. And most people in the CIA really don't know what's going on any more than most people in the FBI and most people in government know. Everything is secret, and that's why, of course, we can't let the American people know what's really going on. You need to get my book, Brotherhood of Darkness. That's Brotherhood of Darkness. You certainly need to get my talks on The Forbidden Secret and The Dark Secret, and they're both available by calling 1-800-544-8927, and there's a syllabus with either one of them. You need to get Joanna Michelson's DVD. It's called The Beautiful Side of Evil. You need to get our 4-tape sets on the supernatural. You need to get our 4-CD or 4-tape sets on satanic crimes and the book on satanic crimes, and find out how the Bilderbergers, made up of the leaders of the world, involved deeply with pedophilia. You need, of course, to get our 4-tape set on the Bohemian Grove. And if you want to get the material from them, we have their publication where they talk about how they revere the owl. Of course, the owl is their deity. The owl is their deity. You can just request that. We'll send it to you free of charge. If you get anything else from us, it comes from the pages of their publications. What is the owl? It's an emblem of Satan. If you'd like to see what really goes on there, we have the excellent DVD by Alex Jones on the Bohemian Grove. We got a 4-tape set on the Bohemian Grove. We got a 4-tape set on Skull and Bones and a couple of books on Skull and Bones. This most secret society that keeps providing, well, there's 2 presidents recently and the one presidential candidate, that was John Kerry, who ran against George Bush, and both of them were members of the Skull and Bones. When Tim Russert had the audacity to ask them both on national television to talk about the secret society they belong to, and both of them said, oh, it's so secret we can't discuss it. And then remember what happened to Tim Russert. Well, maybe he just died from a heart attack at a very young age. Maybe that's all that happened. And then, of course, we got 4-tape sets on so many things. If you want to understand who killed Martin Luther King, we got a 4-CD set on that. It wasn't James Earl Ray. If you want to know who killed Bobby Kennedy, it wasn't Saran 4-CD set. We even have a book and a DVD on that. We've got the 4-CD set and a video and a DVD on the USS Liberty, where, of course, they tried to kill almost 230 American sailors, and, well, that's another story. Please pray for Radio Liberty.